Sarah arrived at the café 10 minutes earlier than the agreed time. The place was not particularly well furnished and not very clean, but it was close to Tina's workplace. Tina worked at a prestigious beauty salon and was a manicurist. 2 years ago, Sarah's close friend had recommended Tina, saying she was a genuinely pleasant girl who understood clients' wishes. And so it was. The women developed a warm, friendly relationship, sharing dreams, goals, life stories and advice. And, yesterday, Sarah got an unexpected call from Tina. Surprised, as she had no plans to visit the salon any time soon, she had no idea what could be the matter. "Hi, Sarah, it's Tina. I need to talk to you about something important. It won't take long, but it's critical." "Can we discuss it over the phone? At least give me a hint." "No, it's not a phone conversation. Can we meet during my lunch break tomorrow?" "Well, sure." "Great, then let's meet at noon. I have a gap in my schedule then. I'll wait for you at the cafe on the corner, where we usually get our coffee to go." So, under the faded, artificial ivy, Tina waited for Sarah. "Have you been waiting long? I think I'm even a bit early." "No, just 10 minutes." Sarah smiled. "So, spill your secrets." Tina's gaze drifted somewhere behind the bar counter, and something in her expression told Sarah that the news was neither amusing nor trivial. A waiter approached, and they ordered double espressos. Tina seemed to force herself to perk up, adjusting her fluffy hair. "All right, no point in delaying. You remember I once told you that in our line of work we hear a lot of personal stuff from clients, and many of us become links in the gossip chain?" "Yes, Tina. I remember your principle of not gossiping about one client to another because you find it distasteful and to avoid trouble at work." "Exactly. Clients' lives are none of my business, and if it was someone else, I would have kept quiet. I'm not trying to be your friend, but we do have a good relationship, and I value that." "Tina, don't keep me in suspense," Sarah said with a smile. "I'm burning with curiosity." "So, 2 months ago, a new client started coming to me, a well-groomed blonde, around 28, dresses stylishly but a bit flashy. She often acts like a sweet, delicate creature, but I doubt she really is. Likes to assert herself by talking about the gifts her boyfriend gives her and their trips. She shows off her new things with enthusiasm and wants me to admire them too, and I do, it's part of my job. It makes the client happy, and they're more likely to come back to me. Anyway, everything is as usual. Then, the day before yesterday, my blonde client comes in, all tanned and beautiful. She tells me she just got back from some Mediterranean paradise, from Cyprus. She spent a week there with her boyfriend. Only a week, because he's some busy businessman, as I understood. I congratulated her and commented on how good she looked. She immediately pulled out her phone and started showing me photos and telling me stories. Here they are eating tiny, tender squid stuffed with something. Here he bought her a collectible ring from some famous jeweller. While I was doing her French manicure, she couldn't stop talking. She was in the mood to share personal details. It turns out her boyfriend is quite a bit older, recently turned 42. Of course he's married, but he hasn't loved his wife for a long time. He was just living out of habit until he met her, the blonde. His wife has always tried to boss him around and only thinks about herself. She's always busy with work and her daughter's studies. She instills the same beliefs in her daughter about the importance of finding one's calling, blah, blah, blah. But it's all just for show. His wife is a daddy's girl who has never had to struggle. First, her father took care of her, then her husband. With those advantages, anyone could find their way in life. But he had to make it on his own, starting from nothing, even from a disadvantage, with no help and only obstacles. That's an entirely different attitude towards life. He and his wife are totally different people. Heather, the blonde, understood that, even without him saying it, just by seeing his apartment. He had brought her home several times while his wife was away. According to him, the most important thing was to receive warmth from a woman. He would provide everything else himself. Heather said that he talked about his love so often, even when she didn't ask, that it was clear he truly loved her. In short, Sara, I hear similar stories quite often. And then she decided to show me a photo of her beloved. "Tell me what you think, honestly," she said. I was prepared to give a restrained approval, to say that I understood her. And then I looked at the first photo and saw your husband, David. There they were, embracing in front of a seaside Italian restaurant. Then another photo of them together in front of a jewellery store window, and more, at the hotel bar and by the pool. On the sea at Aphrodite's beach. She showed me about 20 photos. She sighed and said, "You see, we're so happy together, there's no hiding it." Tina fell silent, took a breath, and added, "I think I did the right thing by telling you. I'm sorry I didn't do it right after Heather left. I was in a daze. I knew I should tell you, but I've never been in a situation like this before, where someone trusts me and I have to betray that trust. On the other hand, if someone is foolish enough to show everyone photos of her married lover, something like this was bound to happen eventually." "Tina, thank you. You did the right thing," Sara quickly and quietly interrupted. "This isn't gossip, it's help. Thank you again for your help. This is not a situation where ignorance is bliss. I've always thought I could handle the truth. Your reputation at the salon won't suffer. You don't need to worry. I'm perfectly rational. All right. I have to go. You still have work and I'm going to a photo exhibition now. It's for work and I'll also have time to sort things out in my head. I'll probably call in a week to schedule a pedicure. I just need to figure out my own schedule first. Bye for now, dear, and thank you very much." "Bye. Make sure you call," was all the astonished and bewildered Tina could say. She couldn't even understand if it was a good thing that Sara was so composed. Most of Tina's acquaintances would have found a bag of insults for their husband and his mistress and rushed to confront them immediately. And no one would have even thought about Tina's reputation. From their first meeting, Tina had sensed that Sara was an interesting and good person. It was because of clients like her that she loved her job. Sara's grandma Nina, if she were alive, would have said, "I told you so." And Sara couldn't remember a time when Grandma Nina had predicted a positive outcome. All the bold endeavours of her relatives and acquaintances, both professional and personal, were doomed to fail according to Grandma's strict standards. As soon as something went wrong, Grandma would appear out of thin air with her "I told you so." Her reaction was often harder to bear than the incident itself, so everyone tried to hide their mistakes from her until the last moment. When Sara decided to marry David, Grandma was particularly distressed. "Is this how it's supposed to be?" she would exclaim, pacing the floor of the large room. "You've read too many silly books about mésalliances and think a happy marriage can come from such a misunderstanding. I'm not saying you don't appeal to this David. Compared to the girls from their district, you're quite impressive, I'm sure. But he's truly in love with the opportunities this marriage opens up for him. Not every guy from the neighbourhood, as they say, is so lucky. He sees clearly that your father will help his son-in-law. You grew up in a sheltered environment and have no idea how people like him fight for their lives from childhood. It's written all over his face and forehead that he's just using you to climb higher." "Grandma, what's wrong with Dad helping David? David will work based on Dad's recommendation. in his own field, which he studied at the university he got into on his own while working. Who cares about someone's background if they behave decently? All right. And when is your foolish wedding? We need to book a banquet hall in advance that won't be too cramped for the guests. A crowded venue ruins even the best organised banquet. Grandma, we're just renting a small café. We decided to invite only our closest people. Grandma Nina's indignation reached new heights. And what about our relatives? You're not inviting them? Weddings and funerals are occasions to gather the whole family. That's how it's done. Grandma, we're just having a small, tasteful wedding with close friends. A month after the modest and elegant wedding with close friends, when Sara and David returned from their honeymoon, Grandma Nina, as usual, had come to terms with all the glaring breaches of order and tradition. But contrary to Sara's hopes, she disliked him faithfully and devotedly until the end of her days. Grandma, you didn't live to see your triumph. I'd like to think you would have been more upset for me than happy about your foresight. And Mum didn't live to see it either. She would have sympathised, though there would have been a flood of tears. Sara was on her third round of the exhibition, pausing at the photographs that helped her think. A conversation with David was inevitable. She had to endure it, just this once. But not in that apartment. She couldn't return there any time soon. She needed time for her disgust to subside. Tonight she would go to her father's and tell him everything, and then she would have to call her daughter Julia and tell her too. But it would be better to wait until Julia's exams were over. Just one more week. There are people who don't live out their own lives and won't let others live theirs either. They're the ones who came up with the idea that living for one's own pleasure is somehow shameful. But everyone wants it. It just doesn't work out for everyone. So that losers come up with nice excuses. But Heather wasn't like that. She wasn't going to obediently live like her mother, paycheck to paycheck, always saving, especially on herself. And to make her dreams come true, she chose a proven and easy way. Generous men. Her boyfriend Lewis was a musician. He played the electric and acoustic guitar beautifully. In their small, sleepy town, where there were few opportunities to make a decent living, his earnings were considered good. He and his DJ friend Arnie were hired for family and corporate parties. As a result, Lewis always had enough money to live on, and his girlfriend Heather could always count on interesting weekends, gifts, and financial help in various situations. But then Arnie did start letting Lewis down more often. Going on binges when they could have been making money. Lewis was nervous and shared his thoughts with Heather. Heather, I think we've hit a dead end here. At first everything was fine with Arnie, but now I need to move on. I can't make enough money alone without a DJ, and Arnie doesn't care about anything anymore. He just wants to drink. It's pointless to talk to him. He looks at me like I'm his enemy. I wouldn't aim for the capital right away, but a state capital would be perfect. I've saved some money for the first few months. It's enough to rent an apartment for 6 months and live while I look for something. Come with me. Heather wasn't sure if Lewis was serious, but she hurried to answer just in case. Don't doubt it for a second. I'm sure my Lewis will succeed. Heather couldn't bear the thought of Lewis leaving alone. If he did, she would have to forget about him, and finding another guy like him in their town would be difficult. Thinking about the men who had shown even the slightest interest in her, Heather realised that none of them could offer such a beautiful relationship. They all had problems with money, and life just passed them by. Of course, there were owners of shops and small businesses in their town, but they were all family men with children, and the local gossips kept a close eye on their lives. Heather knew girls who had moved to big cities to study or work, but she wouldn't have dared to move far from home alone. Moving to a big city meant spending the first few years and half her salary on rent, scrimping on everything, and cooking dinner at night for the next day. Heather valued her comfort too much to sign up for all that. However, if she wasn't going alone, but with the caring Lewis, it might be a chance worth taking. And Lewis was serious. He had connected with someone who was looking for a guitarist to play at events. "So, Heather, are we going?" Lewis asked in a serious tone, demanding an immediate answer. "Yes, Lewis," Heather replied without hesitation. The chief accountant of the bus depot where she worked, upon receiving Heather's resignation, sneered and warned her that there was a line of candidates ready to take her place. And if things didn't work out in the big city, she wouldn't be taken back. Heather nodded and left for the new life in a big city. The euphoria of moving to a big city lasted only a few days. Heather quickly realised that things were not going as planned, and she had to accept it, at least for now. This city was changing Lewis rapidly. He was no longer the generous Lewis she knew and loved in their small town. He said that until he started making good money, they had to save. "Heather, my dear, this isn't forever. We just need to get established here. You see, we're paying for this one-bedroom apartment as if it were a penthouse. So, let's eat at home for now, okay? I don't need Michelin-starred restaurants. Simple fried potatoes with meat will do." "But you asked just 5 minutes ago if there were any responses to my resume," Heather reminded him. "Are you saying that after a day at the accounting office, I should also fry potatoes for you?" "Heather, me, you, what's the difference?" Lewis said, widening his honest eyes. "When I'm free in the evening, I'll cook. I won't dump all the housework on you. Don't worry. Once we make a little money, we'll go out to restaurants more often and treat you again." It soon became clear that the promised prosperity would take at least a couple of months. In reality, after 6 months, Heather could compile a long list of bitter warnings for inexperienced girls considering a similar move. She realised with dismay that her life was not improving. 5 days a week, she worked in the accounting department of a small manufacturing company and earned more than she did in her hometown. But the landlord raised the rent, and Lewis's earnings remained unstable. He had fallen out with the leader of the band he had come to join, and was struggling to make it on his own, which filled Heather with quiet horror. They were growing increasingly distant. He was no longer tender and attentive, no longer cooed at her, and would stand at the stove frying potatoes or eggs with a sullen expression. Heather tried to have lunch at an inexpensive café in the business centre, where she worked, and skipped dinner to avoid cooking. She felt that something needed to change, but she had no idea how. She was used to relying more on luck than on herself. Fortunately, luck smiled on her soon enough. She finally met the man she had been eyeing for a while, and managed to impress him with her gentle demeanour. Her new hero worked in the same large business centre in the city centre as she did. He drove a not too new but decent car. He was probably in his 40s or a bit older, certainly not an ordinary manager. Those wore suits that subtly resembled neat uniforms, but this man dressed stylishly, with interesting accessories, and clearly spent money on his appearance. Noticing and appreciating him, Heather decided to have a try. She stopped getting coffee from the cheap café where she had had her business lunch, and started frequenting the stylish café he visited. Soon the pleasant stranger began to recognise the familiar beautiful face at the table by the column, and would nod at her when he saw her in the café. Before long, he developed the habit of looking in the direction of that table as soon as he entered. To avoid getting her hopes up too soon, Heather decided to test her theory. She changed her usual spot and chose a different table in a dark corner. Her joy knew no bounds when she saw the man looking around in confusion, and when he spotted her, he couldn't hide his broad smile. So he did remember her. Now she couldn't wait to speed things up. Heather got along well with her boss, the chief accountant. They worked together in a tiny office, separate from the production area, which was more cost-effective for the owner. When there are only two of you, you inevitably get to know each other better. Heather was surprised to learn that the chief accountant, Bethany, was the same age as her mother, but looked much younger. She talked and thought about different things. Heather decided to show Bethany a photo of her mysterious stranger and ask if she knew who he was. "Yes, he's interesting," Bethany confirmed. "No, I don't know him. He's too young for me, and I don't get involved in such adventures. I prefer men my own age. But he's perfect for you. He's older, so you'll be young and beautiful to him, whereas men your own age take your beauty for granted. Why don't you ask the bartenders? They're nice guys and know a lot about their visitors." The next day, Heather decided to ask them. To her surprise, the bartender didn't smirk or react indifferently. Instead, he answered professionally. "He's a regular, been coming here since we opened. My favourite type of customer, never complains, always satisfied. He doesn't chat much with the staff, but we know him. His name is David. He works for a small firm that trades technical equipment and components with the Koreans. Their office is 1 floor below yours. He's the technical director and deputy general manager. That's all I can tell you. If you want my personal opinion—" "Yes, I'd like to hear it," Heather encouraged him. "He's a decent guy, calm, polite, and knows what he wants," the bartender said, with a hint of a smile. "So, he's smart," Heather laughed. David, who until recently had been a nameless stranger, was becoming more and more appealing to her. That evening she thought about the most likely obstacle. He was probably married. She had no experience with married men, but she knew that if a man was calm, polite, and not poor, he was likely married by the time he reached his 40s. Even if he was divorced, it wouldn't be for long. "Just don't get involved with married men," her mother had warned her before she left, surprising Heather with her advice. At the time, Heather had smiled in confusion. She was leaving with Lewis, so why would her mother think that? Did she suspect that Heather and Lewis's paths would quickly diverge in the big city? Heather had thought her mother was narrow-minded, but it turned out she was quite perceptive. The next day, Heather caught a cold and spent 3 days in bed in her rented apartment. Fortunately, Lewis wasn't around. He was busy meeting new band members and trying to fit in. In the evenings, he would share his impressions with Heather, who struggled to feign interest. After all, she was sick and found it difficult to concentrate. When Heather returned to work, Bethany greeted her with a mysterious smile and shared some news. "I went to your favourite café on Friday to try their macchiato. It really is delicious." As I was sipping my coffee at the counter, David walked in. He scanned the tables looking for someone interesting and then asked the bartender, "Does the girl who usually sits at that table by the column still come here?" I casually joined the conversation and said, "She has a slight cold. As her boss, I'm very sorry about that. Maybe if she knows you're concerned, she'll recover faster. By the way, her name is Heather." He gave me a restrained smile and said, "Yes, please tell her that her table neighbour is worried." "That's it, my dear," Bethany said, winking at Heather and handing her a stack of fresh invoices. Heather enjoyed reminiscing about the details of her first encounter with David. It seemed like they just needed a little push to meet each other, and Bethany's intervention provided that push. Everything suddenly became much simpler. When Heather was having her usual coffee, David walked into the café, smiled at her, and headed straight to her table. She had never had such an easy and smooth introduction to a man before. Everything fell into place from that very first day. Before she knew it, David declared that their relationship had become an important part of his life. As Bethany ironically remarked, the wheel of fate had begun to turn. It seemed like this was the rare chance Heather had been waiting for, and all she had to do was take a small risk. She didn't hesitate for long. After all, her relationship with Lewis had run its course, and returning home was not an option. It would be like admitting defeat, and her envious competitors would be all too happy to see her fail. Life back home would never be the same. She would always be second-rate. So Heather told Lewis that she was moving out. "Heather, I understand that you're tired," Lewis began. "I promised you a bright future, but things didn't turn out as planned. But I wasn't lying. I truly believed it. Please just calm down and wait a little longer. Things are finally starting to fall into place. Don't be so impatient. Please." "Are you even listening to me? Or are you just hearing yourself, as usual?" Heather asked wearily. "Who's being impatient here? I took the first decent job I could find, while you're still picky. In case you haven't noticed, I've been paying for this apartment with my salary for the past 2 months. If your career is finally taking off, then you have nothing to worry about. You can afford to pay for this place yourself. I found a cheaper apartment that suits me just fine." Lewis couldn't believe that Heather was serious about leaving. He was used to her not making decisions and relying on him. Living independently always made her uncomfortable. It hadn't even occurred to him that she might have found another man, and she didn't reveal her cards, simply packed her things into a suitcase, called a taxi, and left. David had rented her a small but cosy studio apartment, much nicer than the run-down place she had shared with Lewis. He assured her that the rent was reasonable because the owner was a good friend of his, and Heather wouldn't have to pay anything. David could easily afford it. What Heather found particularly appealing about David was his honesty. He told her right away that he was married, but that his feelings for his wife had long since faded. He lived with her out of habit, like many people do. Heather knew that all married lovers often said the same things, but she stubbornly believed that her case was special. After all, there were plenty of exceptional cases. She just needed to come up with a plan to push David to divorce his wife and marry her. It was a complex task, and she had to act carefully to avoid ruining everything. And then Lady Luck smiled on Heather once again. David's wife, Sara, filed for divorce after discovering his infidelity. David was initially shocked and disoriented by the unexpected turn of events. Previously, he had insisted that obtaining a divorce from his wife would be extremely difficult. Heather had believed him, assuming that successful and established men were not easily let go. David had mentioned that their daughter Julia was studying in the capital and was still quite young and sensitive. He had said that they needed to wait a bit longer to avoid upsetting her. While Heather pondered how to persuade David to prioritize their relationship over his daughter's feelings, Sara swiftly resolved the matter. She filed for divorce without considering Julia's emotions, and even moved out of their shared apartment immediately. It turned out that Sara had a stubborn and principled character. "But it's for the best," David announced to Heather almost cheerfully. "Move in with me. We'll live together. Isn't that what you want?" "Of course, darling," Heather hastily assured him. "Why pay extra for my tiny place?" "We'll spend that money together," David agreed. Bethany advised Heather to constantly demonstrate her understanding and support to David. Now is the perfect time to show him what he'll gain by marrying you. He shouldn't doubt that he needs this. My friend once waited 5 years for her married lover to divorce his wife. He finally did, but then he kept postponing their new marriage, making excuses. And then she found out he had married someone else, a much younger girl. He said marrying mistresses was bad form. So, if David invites you to live with him, agree. At least you'll see him more often and get to know his daily habits. In everyday life, David was not demanding and had an even temperament, unlike Lewis, who justified his moody outbursts by claiming he was a creative person. Heather silently congratulated herself. She was doing everything right. A more understanding, tender and cheerful partner than her would be difficult to find. She even offered to accompany David to the divorce hearing. "I can see you're nervous, David. There's nothing shameful about it. Anyone in your situation would be nervous. If I go with you, it will guarantee that your ex won't try to pull any stunts. She won't want to show her true feelings in front of me. I know women like her. Just trust me." David did not object, and they went to court together. Sara turned out to be exactly as Heather had imagined from the photos, a slim brunette with a cool smile. She had nothing striking about her, not even bothering with a proper hairstyle or manicure, yet she carried herself like a queen. She walked past David and Heather with a lazy gait, smiled enigmatically, and casually waved the thin folder of documents she was carrying. Someone must have joked that she had a Mona Lisa smile, and she believed it. Overall, she seemed too self-assured. The courtroom, which smelled heavily of dust from the thick curtains and massive cabinets, contained only the judge, the secretary, David, Heather and Sara, who was about to become David's ex-wife. Heather barely listened to the judge's words, finding the legal terminology confusing. She understood only that the parties did not wish to reconcile. The judge's monotonous phrases nearly put her to sleep when suddenly she felt as if a blanket had been ripped off her. "Mrs. Scram, can you provide the court with documents proving that the apartment in question should remain solely in your possession after the divorce?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honour," Sara replied, rising from her seat and calmly handing the folder to the judge. The moments between the judge taking the documents and speaking again felt like an eternity to Heather. She glanced at David and noticed he had paled beneath his tan. He seemed to shrink, no longer resembling the respectable man she had fallen for and left Lewis for. Heather felt a wave of confusion and anxiety. "Yes, the apartment was indeed bequeathed to you by your late mother before your marriage," the judge confirmed. "Mrs. Scram, did your husband contribute financially to improving the living conditions, such as paying for renovations?" David opened his mouth to speak, but Sara answered first. "No, Your Honour. The apartment has been renovated twice and even had a legally approved redesign, but my father paid for these expenses. He is a meticulous man and probably still has the receipts. The brigade of workers he hired can also confirm who paid them." "Thank you, Mrs. Scram," the judge said, then turned to David. "Mr. Scram, as far as the court is aware, the apartment where you lived with your spouse is not your only residence." "No, Your Honour," David admitted grimly. "I did not contribute financially to the renovation of my wife's apartment because I was saving money to buy my own property. I did not want to feel like a kept man because my wife comes from a wealthy family. 5 years ago I purchased a studio apartment." "Is that the same studio you supposedly rented for me?" Heather wanted to interrupt, but she held her tongue, knowing they were in court. It seemed like David was not the provider and protector in this family. Sara's father was. Sara herself did not appear helpless at all. "You're such a fool, Heather," she thought to herself. No wonder Sara filed for divorce so readily. Any woman in her position would have done the same when there's nothing to lose but a cheating husband who lies to impress girls. What did David expect from their relationship? That she would accept his mediocrity and continue to love him as he was? He's just another Lewis, honestly. Heather's head was spinning with questions, and she could no longer pretend to be a loving kitten. But she couldn't cause a scene in the courtroom, especially not in front of Sara. "I need to go," she whispered to David, standing up and grabbing her bag. She quietly walked along the wall towards the exit. Before she knew it, she was outside, feeling the intense heat. She longed for cold water, not just to drink, but to pour over her head to cool down. Heather stood in the middle of the sidewalk for a couple more minutes, then quickly, almost running, she hurried away from the courthouse building. Meanwhile, Sara feared that she might feel sorry for her husband's mistress. She didn't consider all wives to be saints and all mistresses to be shameless. Life wasn't that simple. Tina had painted a portrait of a girl who could be pitied. The girl had gone hunting, thinking that she had caught a bird by the tail, only to find a plucked goose in her hands. Her father, upon learning of the impending divorce, immediately asked, "You won't change your mind, will you? I've often seen women forgive their husbands for such adventures over time, and family life really improves." "No, Dad." Sara sadly smiled. "You're not original in your opinion. It's just that not all adventures are the same. For David, this wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment or a closed loop where he loved both his family and another woman. He lived with me out of convenience. He found it convenient to have this relatively stress-free, well-paying job with you, this apartment, and the opportunity to relax. He's not stupid and understands perfectly well that he skipped a few hard steps by becoming my husband. He could have at least kept quiet about me when he was with her, out of basic human decency, but he told her every day how much of a bossy, cold, domineering ice queen I was. He could have at least lied and said something closer to the truth." "Yes, indeed, that's nonsense," her father agreed, raising his grey eyebrows and hurriedly hugging his Sara. Mr. Harriman had already said goodbye to David the very next day after Sara filed for divorce, and his joy was boundless. Finally, he had a good reason to get rid of this careless son-in-law, whom he kept around only out of love for his daughter. David tried to maintain his composure but failed. "I understand your feelings, Mr. Harriman," he said pompously but unconvincingly, "but I am sure that you are an objective person and do not mix personal matters with work. If my new employer needs references from my previous job, can you provide them?" "Unfortunately, Mr. Scram," Mr. Harriman said softly, "I have mixed business with personal matters so much that I am disgusted with myself. If I had hired you from a job advertisement all those years ago, we would have worked together for a maximum of 6 months and parted ways. Of course, I won't ruin your resume. Write whatever you want in it, but I won't recommend you to anyone. I could, of course, advise competitors to hire you for a key position, but they would consider it mockery, and I still stand for civilized business." Mr. Harriman enjoyed watching David desperately try to hide his irritation and confusion. He didn't consider himself a vindictive person, but he wasn't ashamed of his satisfaction. Heather packed her things into a suitcase and gloomily scolded herself. That's why she was so unlucky, why she always ended up with the wrong men. She needed to clarify everything thoroughly from the start, not rely on luck. But the main thing now was to pack all her belongings, including gifts, and slip out of the apartment before David returned. Heather suddenly shuddered. She had been so preoccupied with her clothes that she hadn't noticed the key turning in the lock. She managed to assume a casual pose and froze in it. Sara stood in the doorway. David was coming from the trial, so exhausted that he even remembered the long-forgotten hard work in his parents' vegetable garden. Yes, he came from the most ordinary family, where they grew food in the garden, as if that would surprise anyone. And Heather herself was just like that. Even though she pretended to be a carefree, glamorous girl, they were very similar, which was why they got along so well. The main thing now was to convince Heather of this. Losing the remnants of a comfortable life and his mistress in one day would be too much. David needed to find the words to calm her down and convince her to stay with him. It wouldn't be that hard. She had nowhere to go tonight anyway. Finding suitable rental housing in a few hours was impossible. David had been sure that he would quickly find a suitable job by the scheduled date of the divorce proceedings. It didn't work out. What he was offered for his usual money required 25 hours a day, and his usual volume of work was paid very modestly. David needed Heather now more than ever to keep from falling into despair. When he found a decent job, he would figure out what to do next. The door to the apartment appeared to be closed, but not locked. What a careless girl, the man thought, so relaxed that she even forgot to lock the door. Come in, whoever you want, take whatever you want, and there was still a lot of his things here that needed to be taken out before Sara arrived. Well, at least Heather hadn't thought of disappearing. Suddenly, giggling and women's voices came from the kitchen. Forgetting that he was going to take off his shoes, David stood in the kitchen doorway. The dining table was laden with vases of strawberries, candied fruit and cakes. There was also a bottle of champagne. Seated comfortably at the table like old acquaintances were Heather and Sara. "Hello," they said almost simultaneously, with indifference and without any malice, as they saw David in the doorway, and they clinked glasses, exchanging glances. "Celebrating, I see," was all David could think to say. "Why not?" Sara replied calmly. "We're celebrating the day of getting rid of unnecessary baggage." "And I'm the baggage, of course. Fine, I get it. A scorned woman's revenge, I understand. But you, Heather, what do you have to do with this celebration? Remember, I told you that my ex-wife is a master at using people for her own purposes. So you're greatly mistaken if you think she sympathises with you. She lacks this ability." "I see how much it doesn't bother you," Sara replied almost amiably. "Heather, let's go pack your things." David switched to a business-like tone, instantly deciding it was wiser to ignore Sara. But Heather had no intention of moving. Instead, she settled more comfortably, took the largest strawberry from the bowl and announced, widening her eyes, "I'm curious, on what grounds are you giving me orders? You never officially proposed to me. An invitation to live together is not a proposal. And after your lies, I consider myself a free woman. I've already packed my things. I'm just chatting with the apartment's owner. We're having a nice time, understanding each other, and you can go about your business. I have no claims against you." Looking intently at David, Heather comically wrinkled her nose, as she did when she saw a spider or a frog. "Playing someone else's role?" David sneered. "Your usual cooing suited you better. At least there was some use for you in it. Gifts, travels. So you're mistaken, Heather. You shouldn't confuse yourself with Sara. You can't afford to act this way because she's her rich daddy's girl. She's brave because she'll never stay without her father's support. But you're the ex-girlfriend of a street musician who will soon go back to your village to count wages for workers in a logging company. Do you think I would marry you? Who marries someone like you? You only dream of taking as much as you can get at a man's expense. You use men, and when you use them, you play the innocent victim. If anyone has the right to accuse me of lying, it's certainly not you. Even your guitarist won't take you back now. He's probably already found someone simpler, without glamorous pretensions." "We've heard enough of your performance," Sara interrupted calmly but loudly. "Keep your composure and pack your things, please." Sara spoke to David as if he were a rude teenager, while Heather sat silently, enjoying her strawberry with obvious relish, not looking offended at all, despite everything that had been said. David imagined how humiliating it would be to rummage through the closets, pulling out his pants and shirts, to the giggles from the kitchen, and simply left the apartment, loudly throwing the keys on the floor and slamming the door. A grown man, Sara huffed, and caused such a drama. I'm sorry if my idea upset you. I didn't expect him to act like that. I still thought better of him, it turns out. I'm not surprised at all, Heather declared. Men like him treat any of us without respect. No, I'm no saint. He's right about the calculator in me, but he pretended to be respectable just to keep me. I never lied to him. I honestly told him who I am, where I'm from, what situation I'm in, and that I need support and patronage, not paradise. He knew all this, and now he's offended for some reason. Heather shrugged, trying to match Sara's composure. Let me settle with you right away, for the favour, Sara remembered. Thank you. Not everyone would have stayed until he arrived and pretended to have fun. But I would add that not everyone would have suggested it, Heather replied, taking the neatly placed bills from the table. When I saw you in the doorway, I expected a scandal and was ready to defend myself with suitcases. You should hate me. You have every right to. I'm sure David told you I'm a terrible egoist. Sara laughed. It's true, I love myself, so I'd be sorry to waste my energy on hatred. I'm even grateful to you for appearing in time. I would have kept living, wasting my life on this David, and not knowing what kind of person he is. He's not just a cheater, he's malicious and petty. I agree, Heather confirmed with pleasure.